This is Wrestling Nostalgia with Dave Dynasty. Greetings, wrestling fans, and welcome to Wrestling Nostalgia. I am your host, Dave Dynasty. This is the podcast where we talk, about wrestling nostalgia. All of our wonderful memories of the past and, the few things here in the present that help to trigger those memories as well. Once again, I am Dave Dynasty. We got a great episode for you again today. We're being joined again by author and historian Richard Vicek for part 3 of our discussion of the WWA, this time 1974 to 1985. This pretty much wraps up the run of the WWA in Indianapolis. So lots to talk about today, lots of people to talk about, some great discussion. Always appreciate Richard coming on and talking with me. Always a great time. Before we get there, whatever podcast platform you're listening to, please make sure you subscribe to the show. Give us a rating and review if possible. Share the episodes. Do all those things. While you're out there supporting the show, make sure you follow us on social media. The show is on X, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, just like a Rassle Nostalgia, R-A-S-S-L-E Nostalgia, all one word. And then you can find me personally on X at the Dave Dynasty. Of course, the best way that you can support the show is to go buy a shirt. Go to PROWRESTLINGTEES.com/the Dave Dynasty. We have lots of designs there. Go get yourself one today. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. Not much to talk about to open the show. I'm just excited to get into this conversation about the WWA. You all know it's my favorite topic to discuss, and always a blast, and you guys always love hearing about it. So what do you say we just get right to it, right? Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll be joined by Richard Vicek, and we'll start talking WWA. If you like horror movies, be sure to check out Dave Dynasty and Ike Isaacs on the Listen to Their Screams Horror Podcast. It is available on all podcast platforms and on social media at Listen to Screams. That is Listen, the number 2, and Screams. All right, and welcome back to Wrestling Nostalgia. I'm joined once again by Richard Vicek, and we're going to discuss the history of the WWA, and this time we're discussing 1974 to 1985. Richard, welcome back to the show.
Hey, great to be back and talk about the promotion I grew up with much of the time.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. This is kind of the conclusion of this trilogy. There's going to be another part with discussing Bruiser Bedlam a little bit with Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., but this is kind of the end of the WWA in Indianapolis before they moved to Toledo, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that. And Richard, I'm going to let you kind of take it away, and I'll chime in here and there. But why don't you take it away, and let's roll.
Okay. So we are now in 1974. This is a few years after the peak, the big and best years of the WWA, which was 1972. And with so many wrestling companies, the promoters / owners have to bring in new talent to start new competition, new feuds, new storylines. And in 1974, Ox Baker arrived in the WWA. And he immediately won the WWA heavyweight title from Cowboy Bob Ellis. Previously, in other territories, 2 of Ox's opponents died after their bouts. This was Ramon Torres in 1971 and Ray Gunkel in 1972. Those promoters exploited these tragic events to imply that Ox was responsible for these deaths, and Ox also did that too in his interviews. And then the next big event, just before his arrival, took place at the Cleveland Arena on Euclid Avenue in January 1974. Where Ox was partially responsible for a full-scale riot that ensued in the arena involving Johnny Powers and Ernie Ladd, Bulldog Brower. Anyway, and that film footage was shown all the time on Bob Luce's TV show in Chicago. Ox was brought in as a perfect brawler opponent for Dick the Bruiser, and they battled dozens of times over those 3 years. And then what also helped Ox's impact was he was on Bob Luce's television program in Chicago almost every week during those years. You know, Bob Luce had a studio set up, looked like a talk show, and you could count on Ox Baker to get the fans all riled up. And so that was, Ox was always into mischief on Chicago.
Yeah.
For instance, when Pepper Gomez wanted to prove his cast iron stomach, they rolled a Volkswagen onto his stomach. Well, Ox, after he does that, Ox barges into the scene and attacks one of the wrestlers that helped with the stunt with the Volkswagen. He also did a heart punch number on Chicago Wrestling associate Johnny Case. Hey, he was a big impact during those years.
Yeah, Ox was always one of those guys, wherever he went, and like we're talking here in the WWA, wasn't the greatest worker in the world, but was good at what he did, and
Yes.
had that great look, was a brawler, and and often, you know, like you said with the events, you know, sold the heart punch, right, as being
Yes.
dangerous and being a whatever, a match ender. And yeah, him and Bruiser had some brawls, and were great. And you know, Ox, you can say what you want about Ox, right? The knees went out later and whatever else, but he was a great brawler. And you hear all kinds of people that say, you know, Ox was scary. Ox scared them when they watched TV.
They still
And,
remember him.
Yeah, and I mean, appeared in several TV shows, movies, whatever else, because he had that super unique look.
Oh, yeah, such as the 1981 movie Escape from New York.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was a contestant on The Price is Right
Yeah,
game
that's right.
show.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
he managed to get around and get exposure.
Yeah, yeah, and again, a perfect foil for Bruiser in Indianapolis and Chicago.
The next big addition to the roster in 1974 was the tag team, as Bruiser paired veterans Rene Goulet and Don Fargo as the Legionnaires. They became known respectively as Sergeant Jacques Goulet and Private Don Fargo. The Legionnaires dressed their parts with balloon pants, riding crops, visor caps, and French flag trunks. Sergeant Jacques Goulet was the sadistic unit commander, while Fargo was the blindly obedient subordinate. Now, us fans in WWA got a little chuckle out of this because we remember 5 years earlier when Don Fargo portrayed the role of Jack Dillinger in the Chain Gang. So, you know, that's okay. We knew that immediately, but you can't ignore the contributions of the Legionnaires during those years. They held at some point WWA tag team champions. They even got some exposure in Chicago in main events at the amphitheater. After most of the first year, Fargo left the Legionnaires, and veteran Quebec wrestler Pierre Lefleur was brought in as Soldier LeBoeuf. In fact, people may remember Lefleur later as a lumberjack in the WWF.
Yeah.
So while the Legionnaires were never a substitute for the Blackjacks, they certainly were formidable opponents, and it was a pretty reliable and unique gimmick for the time.
Yeah, well, a lot of times, most people, when they think of the mid to late 70s, WWA, the Legionnaires pop to mind, right? They were always featured well, always had that unique gimmick, that great look, did some great promos in the roles, and like you said, were successful as a tag team, had the run as champs. I think when I think back to the 70s WWA, the Legionnaires always pop to mind as one of the highlights and the prominent features, and had some great matches there, wrestling, Bruiser and different cohorts in tag team matches.
For sure. One of the biggest news developments in the WWA during 1974 was the departure of Pretty Boy Bobby Heenan. Since 1965, for the most part, he was the #1 nemesis for Dick the Bruiser, and Heenan managed a never-ending stable of heels. A lot of those we've discussed in the first and second episodes. Nobody bled more in the WWA during that time, and that type of impact was never achieved once he left for the AWA. In fact, the event that caused this departure was in September 1974, where Wilbur and Dick staged their first show at the newly constructed Market Square Arena, which reports are that building held close to 15 to 16,000, which would have made it the largest selling show in the history of that promotion since they started promotion in 1964. And Heenan was Dick the Bruiser's tag partner, believe it or not, in a main event versus the Sheik and the Sheik's manager, Eddie Creechman. Well, as some people might project, Heenan turned on Dick the Bruiser, and it was some of the biggest heat ever generated during that series. After the bout, Heenan got a paltry $600 payout, being in the main event on a card that easily could have grossed $90,000 to $100,000. So, and that was the end with Heenan, as he told Bruiser, "That's it." And reportedly, Bruiser told him, "Well, if you think you'd do better somewhere else, go ahead." And this was a big loss for the WWA, and the WWA never recovered for this and never achieved their earlier success. So,
yeah,
sometimes. Go ahead.
No, I mean, obviously, if you lose Bobby Heenan, I mean that's an impact, right? That was the top adversary for Bruiser for so long, and the bump machine, the bleeder, he was something else. He called Bruiser's bluff and went on obviously to great success. And I from what I've heard, I think Heenan held a grudge against Bruiser from there on out.
Yeah,
and never really forgave or forgot that whole incident, and maybe rightfully so, right? I mean, he was helping to draw, and maybe he deserved a little better payout, I would suspect.
Yeah.
But and we're getting ready to talk about handsome Johnny Starr, and no disrespect to Johnny, I love John, and everything else. So but it's not Bobby Heenan. Anybody that come after is going to be compared, and it's not Bobby Heenan. Mm-hmm. So that's, to me, I think as you look at the WWA, that's the first big nail in the coffin, yes. or one of the biggest nails in the coffin. When Bobby Heenan leaves, that's an impact you can't recover from.
Yes. And, this is just meant as a rhetorical question. In 1987, at the WWF's WrestleMania 3, Heenan was in the main event, seconding Andre the Giant against Hulk Hogan in the biggest live wrestling event up till that time. And Heenan got paid $100,000 for his duties that day at WrestleMania 3 in Pontiac, Michigan. Bruiser was alive again, and I couldn't help but wonder, gee, Bruiser, what do you think now?
Yeah, really.
I mean, there's no way and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Heenan was going to leave at some point.
Yeah,
it was going to happen. No offense to Bruiser, the trajectory of Bruiser and the WWA didn't match the trajectory of the rest of the country. Heenan was going to be a target of Vince McMahon no matter what. Mm-hmm. At some point, no matter where he was going to get poached by Vince McMahon. He was just too talented.
Yeah.
And but if he hadn't left, Heenan had some really good years in the AWA with Nick Bockwinkel and everything else. Sure. So it's interesting to think what if Bobby or if a Bruiser had just paid Bobby, what would the WWE have been like for a few more years there? And again, no disrespect to Johnny Starr, Saul Creechman, the different managers that came after to try to fill that top manager heel role. Mm-hmm. They're not Bobby Heenan. And if for a few more years, if you put Bobby Heenan in there, it's gonna make an impact. There's just no way about it.
Yeah, and Heenan is universally recognized as the greatest wrestling manager of all time.
Yep.
I've never heard anyone list another wrestler above Heenan.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even managers they're like, it's Bobby Heenan and the rest of us. I mean, there's just no comparison. The guy had it all, right? I mean, and not only was he a great manager, talker, whatever else, he was a great worker in the ring.
Mm-hmm.
He could take bumps, he could bleed. He was, people don't think of that part of it. They don't notice that part of it because of the interviews sometimes. But without Bobby Heenan taking those bumps and bleeding for Dick the Bruiser, I mean, things change. It's different.
Yeah.
So it would have been interesting to see if they got a few more years out of Bobby Heenan in the WWA.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, in order to replace Bobby Heenan, the new character was developed, Handsome Johnny Starr. Starr real name was John B. Davis, a scholar athlete from Greenfield, Indiana, who used to watch WWA TV as a kid. In 1972, Davis promoted a high school WWA spot show in his hometown. And he did this to get exposed to the wrestling owners. The main event that card was Wilbur against Blackjack Mulligan. After that, Davis wanted to promote opposite the WWA in the state of Indiana, but that's a no-no. You don't promote opposite an existing promoter.
Yeah.
And the state athletic commissioner suggested to Starr that he should try out with the WWA as a talent. His first character was Giaco Chino, the Italian mobster. But then Bruiser made him Handsome Johnny Starr. Starr managed the big name villains at the time, Ox Baker, the Legionnaires, Chuck the Monster O'Connor. Who was that, Dave?
That is Big John Studd.
Yes, that's very early in his career. This is 10 years before the Andre the Giant feud.
Mm-hmm.
Big Chuck the Monster O'Connor comes to the WWA. He teams with Ox for some time also. And so we still want to recognize Handsome Johnny Starr.
Yeah.
That was about the only territory he materially stayed with. But he did a adequate job, a very good job, and he went on to better things, to become a minister in the Disciples of Christ Church.
Yeah, Johnny's a great guy. He's a friend of the show, and a talented guy. And it's one of those deals where just unfortunately, when you're following Bobby Heenan, no matter how good you are, I mean, you have those comparisons. So it's not fair to Johnny, to have to do that, because in his own right, he was a great guy, great talent, very talented, and had a great run in the WWA to be proud of. It shouldn't be compared to Heenan, right? Because Heenan's in a class of his own, and we should really just look at Johnny Starr for what he did in his own right. And again, I love Johnny. He's a great guy.
Yeah,
such a gentleman, and great to talk to.
Yes. And he was the first person I ever interviewed for the Bruiser book.
There you go. All right.
That was like you said, I did the interview at one of his churches. And so that, I always remember Johnny for that. But anyway, in the mid-1970s, there were other wrestlers that came in and out of the WWA. There was Lou Thesz, who came in for a run, who was 60 years old at the time. There was Pepper Gomez. There were the Bounty Hunters, managed by Cashback Kent. 3 interesting rookies started in the WWA during those years. First, we had Mike Snyder, son of Wilbur. There was Spike Huber, son-in-law of the Bruiser. And Steve Regal, son-in-law of Wilbur. So, there was some young talent that were brought in that made some good contributions, in my opinion. And of course, then the Valiant Brothers came back, this time managed by Major Duke George, which I think was a little poke at Captain Ed George in Detroit, who was the son of the original Sheik.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the rookies.
Yeah, definitely, because, one of the biggest knocks on Bruiser in the WWA is how they aged out, right? You had, and there is a lot to that, right? You had Bruiser, who obviously was, got older, and Moose Cholak, Bobo Brazil, and that's true. They were pushed up into the 80s, and they were elderly. I'm not denying that, but Bruiser did give some of the young guys a chance. With Mike Snyder, Bruce Huber, or Spike Huber, excuse me, Steve Regal, later into the 80s, had Stormy Granzig, different guys like that, Jeff Van Camp, all these different guys who, different levels of talent, but went on to some great, great things even after Bruiser. He did have an eye for young talent. He did give them a chance. I mean, Huber and Regal made a great tag team as the Young Lions. Very exciting. And, got over so well that they were used in Memphis there for a while when the Bruiser was working. That was one of the things that Jeff Jarrett wanted to use. So there is a lot to that. Bruiser relied heavily on some of the reliable guys. To be fair though, those guys still drew, right? They were still attractions. And maybe he didn't fully hand the ball off to these young talents, but there was still some young talent there that was notable. And were very, very talented. Even to this, to this day, you look back on these guys. I mean, Steve Regal went on to some great things after the WWA, and Spike Huber, was a great talent. Mike Snyder was a great talent who I really don't think achieved what he should have achieved in the business. I thought he had a lot more talent to go bigger places than what he did. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about the WWA and what happened to them. And we're getting ready to talk about kind of how the decline started happening. And
sure.
And I don't know, I don't know. Some of that is on Bruiser. Some of it is just being a victim of the change of the scenery, the change of the wrestling business that was happening, and not staying up with that. So
Mhm.
I'm glad that we highlighted some of those young talents because it's often overlooked that, while Bruiser maybe didn't completely rely on these guys, there were some talented young guys in the WWA.
Yes. And during the 1976 to 79 period, there are three arrivals, three guys who I want to give their due credit. Although these guys were the main rivals, usually first for Wilbur and then the Bruiser. But the three people in question were the Masked Strangler. He was, under the mask, veteran John Steele Hill, who previously had experience as Assassin number 2. This is going back to 1965. Guy Mitchell, Guy Heenan, and the Stomper in Detroit. He was a competent and loyal wrestler to the WWA, whose work should be duly noted. The Strangler held the WWA heavyweight title, defeating Pepper Gomez, but then losing the strap to Dick the Bruiser. So, and we could, maybe you want to add, Dave, John Steele Hill also had another identity a few years later in the WWF.
Yep.
Why don't you tell the people about that?
Well, he was Jerry Valiant.
Yes.
And it's wild to think he had a lot of success as Jerry Valiant, right? In the WWF, in the WWA, he came back, did a lot of things, and people don't realize how talented and how much success he had even before that. I mean, he was ever changing, always had a multitude of gimmicks, but just always what they call a good hand, right? One of those guys that was just could go out there and work and have a good match with anybody. Very underappreciated. I mean, he stepped in with the Valiants because Jerry Valiant, got sick, had something in the WWF, and Jerry stepped in and filled in, teaming with Johnny just fine, and became that third Valiant brother that's often overlooked. John Hill is great. He is, to me, is just one of the more underappreciated talents ever in wrestling.
Yes, and he was so appreciated by Dick and Wilbur that sometimes a spot show would be managed by John Steele Hill. He'd work the box office with the venue. He'd do the payoffs, give the finishes. So how many other people did that?
Yeah, really.
I'm just
Bruiser wasn't known for trusting other people too well.
Yeah. Then after the Strangler, the big arrival was the Russian Bear, Ivan Koloff, who was a former WWF champion, defeating Bruno Sammartino in 1971 at Madison Square Garden. And then he came to the WWA for countless bouts with Bruiser. And I think there were 4 consecutive Indianapolis cards with Koloff versus Bruiser in the main event. For a few years earlier, Koloff worked for the outlaw Eddie Einhorn IWA group. And a lot of other promoters blackballed Koloff for doing that, which was running opposition to a existing promoter. That didn't faze Bruiser at all. He recognized Koloff's talent and brought him in. And I think they had a cage match with a climax to the feud was Ivan leaping off the top of the cage and Bruiser just rolls away at the last second.
Yeah.
But that was a big feud which stabilized the business in 1977 in Indianapolis.
Yeah, Ivan Koloff has always been one of my favorite wrestlers.
Mm-hmm.
I loved him in Jim Crockett Promotions, and everything, obviously he did before. Again, he's one of those guys that, I mean, people people talk about it, but I still think he's underappreciated for how great he was.
Yes.
He was so talented.
Yes. And, I do not think he's in the WWE Hall of Fame.
Nope. Unreal.
And I think it is speculated one of the reasons was he participated in a class action lawsuit against the WWA, which was suing the WWA for, concussion-related illnesses and brain injuries, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which those cases were thrown out of court without merit.
Yeah,
but that's why it is said he is not in the WWE Hall of Fame, but deserves it.
Yeah, he does. Unbelievable. The guy that ended Bruno's first reign is not in there.
And
that's just unbelievable.
He challenged Gagne, main evented in AWA. He was part of the Russian tag team in Crockett Promotions in the 80s.
Yep.
Feuding with the Bruiser. He just had a amazing career.
He did. Yeah, just Uncle Ivan was one of those guys. No matter where he went, he was consistent, right? And you just, I don't know, you believed him, right? I mean, he's not Russian, right? He's Canadian.
Yes.
but you believed, and he he was so talented in the ring. Even when he was older in Crockett Promotions, he still was great in the ring. Knew what to do, knew how to get the crowd reaction. Again, was one of those guys, perfect adversary for Dick the Bruiser. And you're talking in the 70s and then everything else when the Cold War and everything with Russia was so prominent. He was just perfect. And he was the kind of guy that Dick the Bruiser liked to work with.
For sure. And I remember Ivan telling me he was one of the first guys I interviewed after Johnny Starr, and he says he would even ride to Chicago up and back with Bruiser. And he says, he enjoyed that he was respected so highly by Dick the Bruiser.
Yeah.
Hey, the next bit in 1979, another big arrival occurred. That was King Kong Brody, who was also known in other territories as Bruiser Brody. And he feuded with Dick the Bruiser frequently in the WWA. Their in-the-ring conflict included a dressing room brawl in Peoria, Illinois over payoffs, which, by the way, Bruiser settled the account the next week when they were both on a card in St. Louis. But I want to say that the WWA never had a stronger dominant individual personality as Bruiser's primary opponent all those years. I just thought his impact, and of course he didn't sell as frequently as maybe some other villains. But there wasn't a stronger opponent for a Bruiser in Indianapolis and Chicago during those years.
Yeah, I mean it was great, right? To do the feud of the Bruisers, right? And when Brody beat him and Dick goes on TV or whatever, says that he doesn't deserve to be Dick the Bruiser, right? And he's going to be should be referred as Dick the Loser and this and that and kind of owning up to that and having some battles over the name Bruiser, and it just made sense, right? And Bruiser Brody was such that traveling attraction at that time that could go. Everybody knew who he was from the magazines and everything else, so he could go into a territory and pop attendance and pop a crowd, and it's interesting to see these two because you have Dick the Bruiser and Bruiser Brody, neither one known for overselling for the other their opponents. So, but yeah, it was a great rivalry, right? And Brody, like you said, Brody called Bruiser out on the payoffs, and Dick the Bruiser ended up making it right, and they did business together.
Mm-hmm. Well, now I think once Brody left, let's call it the beginning of the end, which was around 1980. You know, here's one thing that I've written about before, and I'm sure most people will agree that wrestling is a young man's game. Bruiser and Snyder were big stars in the 1950s, but now it's 25 years later. And in 1980, Bruiser, Snyder, Moose were 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Bobo was 55. You know, in almost any athletic activity, you cannot beat Father Time. Competitive ice skaters deteriorate. So do footballers and basketball and hockey. You know, there's just very few exceptions. And by the time 1980 moved along, so many of these big name visitors that we discussed in the 1960s and 1960s had moved on. And few young wrestlers in the WWA were getting big pushes.
Yep.
You know, the crowds got so bad that they stopped using Market Square Arena and went back to the old Armory. Because you can't pay high rent on a Market Square Arena and perhaps draw 1,200 people or less. You know.
Yeah.
And one of the things.
It's like Bruiser didn't know, right? There was a place on the card for these guys, right? They could still be on the card, they could still be on the show, but he didn't, like we said earlier, right? There was some great young talent, and he didn't know how to just fully pass it on and fully. I don't know what it was. If he didn't trust, if he just thought he was the draw, if it was an ego thing, whatever it may be, he didn't know how to transition, right? Yeah. Is there a place for Bobo Brazil on the card? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes. Is it main eventing and beating everybody else? Probably not at this point.
No.
So it's like he didn't know how to transition and how to grow and how to kind of move with the times.
Yes.
Like a lot of other promotions did.
And some of those talents said Bruiser did not want to share the spotlight. And people told me Bruiser still thought he was 30 years old.
Yeah, and that's part of what, in 1982, he had a working relationship with Jerry Jarrett in Memphis. And that's what caused it to fall apart, because Jarrett was pushing Kamala and wanted, Kamala to be built as this, unbeatable, this dominating thing. And in a show, I believe it was in Fort Wayne, it was Bruiser versus Kamala or whatever. And Bruiser changed the billing, the card, the billing, and went over on Kamala. And Jarrett's like, that's enough. I'm not doing this. And, Bruiser just he seemingly couldn't step back and didn't know how to step out of that limelight a little bit and let somebody else shine.
Yeah. And of course, during the same time, cable TV competition started heating up.
Yep.
With on WOR-TV, Secaucus, New Jersey, which was the WWF, and on WTBS-TV, Superstation in Atlanta, which was Georgia Championship Wrestling. Those promotions now were being viewed in Indianapolis and Chicago and all points in between. And they had young talent, hot feuds, compelling storylines. I mean, during those 1971, in Georgia, they had the Tommy Wildfire Rich versus Buzz Sawyer feuds.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 80s, they had Magnificent Morocco versus Jimmy Snuka. It was just how can Bruiser, how can wrestling fans keep interest in WWA? And that was my case.
Yeah.
I had these cable stations at home, I ceased watching them. And, in those years, it's when I first had my own videotape cassette recorder. I didn't want to waste the valuable tape on Bruiser's promotion. Now, when Bob Luce would show an early 70s amphitheater film, yeah, I'd pull out the VCR. But, I witnessed that explosion of the WWA in Georgia.
Yeah.
And,
again, that was the biggest death of the territories is cable. It when suddenly you have where before you were seeing your local product, that's pretty much all you're seeing. So that's the wrestling you've known. That's the wrestling you're okay with. And then suddenly when you have this cable explosion and you're seeing a different product that's a little more exciting, a little more whatever you want to say, well, energetic or however you want to put it. Suddenly what you're used to seeing doesn't look as good.
mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. The promotions, the promotions that didn't evolve and didn't keep up with that the times and the trends that were being set, that they just descended, dried up, and died out because they couldn't compete with the markets that were on cable and the product they were showing.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's and we like I said, we talked about the aging out of the Bruiser and the WWA, and that is true. But the biggest nail was probably like everybody else. It was just times were changing. Cable TV was growing and becoming the norm. It was just an unavoidable, evolution of wrestling that I think it was bound to happen no matter what.
And the WWA got into a vicious cycle. They couldn't afford the top name talent anymore.
Yep.
They started using the same finishes that some fans would recognize. Fans would lose interest. Attendance fell. And they couldn't didn't have the cash flow, the hire talent for the next show, for the next series of programs. So it was a downward spiral, and they resorted to gimmick and look-alike wrestlers like the World Warriors or Gary Lawler or Abdullah the Insane One.
Yeah.
That's like Jack Pfeffer practices.
Yeah. And I mean,
back 20 years earlier.
Yeah. And like you said, it is what it is. Bruiser, he booked who he could book because he wasn't, wasn't drawing the same, wasn't making the money. So it was, you can't, if the money's not there, you can't grow.
There are spot shows where his calendar shows he was only paid $75.
Yep.
And I'm sure. So, and what also didn't help the WWA on keeping talent was by 1983, they had lost their paydays and exposure at the International Amphitheater. Vern started to take over there. And Wilbur, of course, then Wilbur retired and was bought out by Bruiser. Steve Regal, Wilbur's son-in-law, left the WWA for greener pastures and eventually co-held the AWA tag titles. And then in 1984, the sitting WWA champion, Spike Huber, left his wife, Michelle, who was Bruiser's daughter, and that didn't help the situation at all. The title was vacated, and Spike actually attempted to promote opposite Bruiser in small-town venues.
Yeah. By this time, it was kind of getting to be a mess. In 83, like you're talking about with Lucia Chicago and Vern, but 83, Vern was going the opposite. Vern boomed in 83 because he had Hulk Hogan. And this was right, Hulkamania was being born, and Vern's was was booming at this time. Bruiser was not. So they weren't on level playing field, right? It was different. And then, Bruiser, he puts the belt on Spike Huber and this and that, thinking, hey, it's safe. This is my son-in-law. This is, a guy I can rely on to be here. And then he couldn't. And, he just, then around that time is when he just puts the belt on Stormy Granzik with the Phantom title change and this and that. And it was just, kind of a mess. Lots of things happening. Bruiser not, trying to hold on, not being willing to just accept that, hey, this is it. Maybe it's passed me by. And
I was told by Dick the Bruiser Jr. that Dick the Bruiser Sr. had to go into his own pocket sometime to subsidize the operations of the WWA, especially for TV, which by then was only in Indianapolis.
Yeah.
They didn't even have the funds to use, TV slots in Terre Haute, Elkhart, and Fort Wayne.
Yeah. And then, and then, again, in 85-ish, we get, Bruiser kind of being approached by Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., who had lots of connections in Toledo, Ohio, and had some backers with some breweries and Sam Botek and different things there. So Graham Jr. kind of bought into the WWA. They moved its base of operation. Well, I believe it moved to Detroit, did some tapings in Detroit, but later wound up in Toledo, Ohio, kind of evolving into WWA Bruiser Bedlam. And, it didn't do bad because I think Dr. Jerry Graham Jr. had more of a sense of what they were, that they were more of just a small regional, not competing, they're not going to compete with Vince. And I think he was a little more settled into his pocket of what he was doing. And, they hung on till 89. Bruiser, I know, died a couple years later, held on, promoted some spot shows all the way up to almost his death. And the good thing I think kind of about the move to Toledo and the Bruiser Bedlam, Moose Cholak, Bobo Brazil, those guys were there, but they weren't featured quite as prominently. Bruiser did color commentary mostly with Terry Sullivan, and it wasn't, there was some great, some really good talent I think in Bruiser Bedlam, but again I think they knew they were kind of just a little regional promotion in Ohio and didn't try to overstep and exceed their means like maybe Bruiser did. But by 85, when and that happening, the WWA that we all knew had pretty much ended. Bedlam was almost like a different promotion. The lineage might be there, but it's different, right? It moved from Indianapolis, and the era of the WWA powerhouse in Indianapolis was dead, gone.
Yeah. But, when you look back, there are a lot of positive things if you want to write an epilogue on the WWA, Mainly that they were a solid and highly respected independent promotion during the territory era. And they prospered for years and years, And both Bruiser and Snyder were inducted into Bob Luce's Wrestling Hall of Fame at the Amphitheater in 1971. And the WWA was a vital partner with Vern Gagne's AWA in the Chicago Wrestling Club from 1966 to 1983. Those guys, Bruiser and Snyder, hired and nurtured not only Bobby Heenan in 1965, but David McLean in 1982, and both of their careers took off afterwards. Dave, you have to remember that a lot of people had their early exposure and experience in the WWA. There was Rip Rogers, Scott Steiner, Dr. Jerry Graham Jr., the great Wojo, Scott Romer, Sam DeCero, who was one of the World Warriors and eventually founded Windy City Wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And it should always be remembered that Bruiser and Snyder are the ones that created the Blackjack and the Valiant Brother tag teams, who went on to bigger and better things.
Yep.
In the state of Indiana, Bruiser's status and image are legendary, and in the business he is known as one of the best brawlers and unique characters of all time. And Snyder was an outstanding technician, but maybe unfortunately not as appreciated because he was overshadowed by the boisterous Dick the Bruiser. See, by 1985, the WWF ran its first show in Indianapolis, January 19th at Market Square Arena, Hulk versus Paul Orndorff. In fact, it's ironical, WWA veterans Jerry Valiant and Bobby Bold Eagle were on the undercard that night. And after Bruiser and Snyder both died in 1991, they each got another Hall of Fame induction. Bruiser with WWE Legends in 2021, and Bruiser in the Thagos Waterloo Hall of Fame, you know, the amateur, because Wilbur was an amateur wrestler at the University of Utah, which was finally duly recognized, let's see here, 23 years after Wilbur passed away, but it was recognized, so we salute that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, a lot of people look back on WWA, and so many people remember because there's so much tape from the 80s, and a lot of people look back at it and think, oh, they had all these old guys, they did this and that, and they overlooked the 70s, and they overlooked the contributions, and like you said, the Valiants and the Blackjacks and all these things that Bruiser and Snyder and the WWA contributed to wrestling. And once upon a time, they were one of the top 3 or 4 promotions in the country. Mm-hmm. And we're a powerhouse, and we're drawing huge crowds, and it's such a rich history there. But again, so many people just base the WWA on the lean years and don't look at the prime. And and that's too bad. That's kind of what we're trying to do is bring a little recognition and a little exposure to how important to the business the WWA truly was.
Well, they certainly made the mark, and I appreciate you allowing me in these 3 episodes to review their solid contribution to wrestling history.
Yeah, like I said, when I want to dive into the history, there's few on your level, Richard, because you've talked to so many of these guys, like you mentioned, and I want to plug you've written the biography on Dick the Bruiser. It's called Bruiser, the World's Most Dangerous Wrestler. Yeah. And still available out there, Crowbar Press. Yeah. Out there, and I highly suggest people go and get that book. It's a great book. Even if you're not particularly so much a WWA fan, just if you're a fan and wrestler in general, Dick the Bruiser, outside the WWA, one of the most important wrestlers of all time. Even despite Indianapolis, I mean, it was a success in St. Louis and Detroit and Chicago, everywhere. I mean, the man was unreal, especially even before he was promoting. Was a huge draw in the 50s. So go get Richard's book. I'll put the link in the bio so people can go check it out. And if you're looking for a last minute Christmas present to grab up for your wrestling fan on your list, I highly suggest you get Richard's book on Dick the Bruiser for them. So
I think Bruiser wrestled in the United States everywhere except Portland territory and Charlotte.
Yeah.
During his entire career. So that's how many people can say that? Yeah.
It is peculiar that he never did go to Charlotte really and do that. I mean, I don't know. It'd be curious to me whether that was by his choice, because you would think at some point there would have been an offer made to come in and do at least some spots here and there, or a little run. And or he was always promoting his own, so maybe it just timing was never right to do that. So, but yeah, he was, again, like you said, appeared everywhere, and always a top draw, and so many notable events and happenings in his career. So yeah, go get that book.
He made national news with the riot at Madison Square Garden in 1957, and with the Alex Karras brawl in Detroit in 1963.
Yep, absolutely.
So that helped solidify his national reputation.
Yeah, and the brawl in Detroit with Karras, everybody thought that was legit. That was a shoot. And for so long, it was kind of like the Lawler Kaufman thing. It blurred the line so well, people didn't know what to believe and what to think, and it helped draw a house when those two met. So it always boggles my mind that Alex Karras was the guy that later was on Webster, and it just makes me chuckle. But
yes,
yeah. So yeah, thanks Richard for coming on and doing these. We'll have you on again in the future when we talk other topics and different things.
Happy holidays to all your listeners, and thanks for your attention.
Absolutely. Again, go buy Richard's book. I can't suggest it enough. I've read it multiple times. It's a very worn version of my book library, and go get that. And like I said, Richard, we'll have you on again in the future because I'm always wanting to pick your brain for your knowledge and experience. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wrestling Fans International Association is back. That's right, the premier fan club association of the 1970s and 1980s has been revived and is back in business. Join today. It's free at thewfia.org. That's thewfia.org. You can also join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/WFIA 1969.
All right, and welcome back to Wrestling Nostalgia. Once again, I am Dave Dynasty. Thank you again to Richard Vicek for coming on and joining me in that discussion of the WWA from 1974 to 1985. Always good to have Richard on. We'll have him on again in the future for some other topics related to WWA history and so forth. Go buy his book, right? There's a link in the show notes. If you do not have the BRUISER book that Richard wrote, get yourself a copy today. It is a great read, and it's a must-have in any wrestling fans library. Like we mentioned earlier, make sure you follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Make sure you follow us on all those social media outlets. Go buy one of the shirts and support the show. This is the last show before the holidays are upon us, so I hope everybody has a great holiday season. I hope everybody gets to spend time with their families, has some relaxing times just to sit back and reflect. And enjoy the important things in life, right? Let's get down to it. It's not wrestling. It's not anything else. It is about you, your health, your mental stability, and your relationships with those that you love. So make sure, give them an extra hug. Enjoy those important things, and let's gear up for 2024. And we'll be back in 2 weeks to kick off 2024 with another episode of Wrestling Nostalgia. But until then, wherever you go and whatever you do, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.